friends, just to round out the lecture we went through earlier this week on ethics, debriefing is essential. Essentially, it's the way you close a study ethically, and it really involves just letting people know the full story, basically. So you clarify what you couldn't tell them, perhaps, at the beginning of the study. Obviously, when you're telling them about the study, you can't say everything, because that would impact their response. But you clarify the nature, if they're stressed, if they had any kind of adverse reaction to the study, if you triggered them in any way, this is where you take a moment to talk to them about that and hopefully kind of mitigate those negative responses or negative consequences, as it were. You ask them what they thought. So they didn't actually tell you everything. There's probably other things that they might have said if you give the opportunity. So ask them what they thought about the study and the stimuli and things like that. And then, of course, very essential, thank them. Let them know that you appreciate their time and effort, that you needed them as part of your research. I think sometimes people overlook this, but participants are the lifeblood of research, so you got to make sure they're thanked. Confidentiality. You want to make sure that you can maintain confidentiality. So essentially, in this case, we're assuring the privacy. You know what confidentiality means. You've seen it probably in agreements and stuff like this. But we're trying to make sure that the privacy of the participants is ensured. And the easiest way to do this is to keep them anonymous, right? A lot of the answers they're going to give you are sensitive. So like, as I said, with my research, I'm asking them a lot of questions about things like racism and sexism and things like that. So they might say things in the context of research they might not just share with people openly. So you want to keep it private. You want to keep it very confidential. Do not confuse confidentiality and anonymity. Confidentiality means that you are going to be keeping the answers private and safe. Right? So you're not just sharing them with anybody, and that you're not going to identify any of the participants to other parties. Anonymity is basically you do not have any identifiable information for the participants. So you don't ask them their name, their social security number, their H number, for example. You try and keep them completely anonymous, and that helps with the confidentiality aspect of it, because if you don't know any details of the person that you can share, you don't run the risk of accidentally sharing them, right? Or having your data stolen or whatever, and identifying the participants. According to the APA, the American Psychological Association, you should keep research data confidentially and safely stored for 5 full years. So you're required to do so should the data be questioned, need to be replicated, reassessed, whatever, 5 full years. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I think this kind of goes without saying, but be courteous. This is, it should be obvious, basically. If you're doing research with participants, treat them courteously, particularly if you're asking them to divulge information that is very private or very sensitive. I was involved in a study on people's perception of death, which of course is very, very at the core of who we are, right? Very scary for many of us. And the researcher I worked with, unfortunately, was very cold about it, very unfeeling. Not objective or distant, but almost callous about it. So when people would say things, his response would often put them off. You could tell they were like, I didn't really think you'd say that or whatever. Anyway, the point of all this is to say that you need to be very courteous, understand that the researcher is not as important as the participants. Kind of this servant model. Anyway, not going to belabor that. Let's move on. Animals. Animals is a different story altogether. So if the book on ethics for human research was about this big, the book on animal research would be about this big, because a lot of it varies on what kind of animals. In my lecture, I used the example of rats, corgis, humans. Same idea. If the animal's cute and fluffy, not just fluffy, because rats are fluffy, cute and fluffy, they get a little bit more rights. If they're closer to us on the genetic scale, they get a little bit more rights. If they are domesticated, they get a little bit more rights. You see how it kind of, basically, if you could keep it as a pet, it gets a lot of rights, So the big thing in this, and all the consideration is the animal treated well? Not just when it's being experimented on, but when it is not being experimented on, right? So, for example, if you're doing research on rats, do you have a rat cage that was designed for 5 rats that has 10 rats in it? That's not treating them well, right? Are they fed well? Do they receive medical care should they need it when they're not involved in experiments? Basically, are you trying to make sure their life is comfortable and safe outside of the research? And of course, the research itself, if you're going to hurt the animal or do harsh experiments, you have to have a darn good reason for doing so. You can't just hurt them without regard. So in many ways, actually, animals have more rights than humans in some research, but it's because we have to be an advocate for them. Once again, going back to a Judeo-Christian model of stewardship. If we're to be good stewards of God's creation, then of course we need to make sure that we treat our animal friends well, particularly when they can't defend themselves. Verbally, obviously, or legally. Anyway. Scientific misconduct. It happens, right? I say it happens, not flippantly, but it does actually happen. Unethical behaviors, we started with a lot of this at the beginning of the lecture, but things like dishonesty, fabrication, plagiarism, stuff like that, you don't ever want to present data as if it's your own. You guys know this. Don't plagiarize, don't cheat. One of the other things that we talk about is discrimination, sexual harassment. Obviously, in any context, sexual harassment is going to be a bad thing, universally, right? But discrimination, let me be clear on this. So if I was doing research, like I said, I'm doing research, I do a lot of research on racism. If I'm doing a study where I only need black African-American participants, right? Black/African-American participants. And I say, and somebody wants to volunteer for my study and they're like, well, I'm Hispanic Latinx, right? Well, if you're not black African-American, I don't want you as part of my study. I'm trying to focus on this particular group, right? That is not discrimination because I am only selecting participants from this group. I have a justifiable reason for not including someone from another group in my research. However, if you fit the group that I am assessing and I deliberately don't allow you to participate, that's discriminatory and obviously unethical. I think it goes without saying that discrimination in any context is also unethical, but it happens in research occasionally too, which is a big no-no. These are all things that can really, really impact a research career, and in some cases end a research career, depending on the severity. And as I said, poorly designed research, it's not one of those everybody gets a trophy things. If you can't do research well, don't do it at all. Poorly designed research actually puts participants at risk, and that's not what we want. Of course, our duty is to protect them no matter what. And finally, sometimes research just gets suppressed. I'm going to throw some examples out here. I don't know why I bother with these transitions on these sort of slides, right? Sometimes research, even good research, gets suppressed, right? So if you look back historically, this is not the earliest example, but Copernicus's heliocentric findings, when he said, no, the sun is the center of our solar system, not the Earth. Of course, he was excommunicated and people just thought he was a heretic. And why would God design the solar system without the Earth in the middle? Of course, now we know that the Earth, which is round, revolves around the sun and not the other way around, right? The Scopes monkey trial looking at evolution, which is still a contentious topic among many people, that we would share a lineage with apes and frogs and those were suppressed because a lot of people felt it was in direct conflict with the Judeo-Christian perspective of creation. The Kinsey sex studies. This is fascinating. Actually, there's been TV shows and movies that have talked about Kinsey and his exploration of that topic. Excellent research, and actually some of the earliest research, formal research, on the topic of sex and sexuality. Fascinating. But of course, sex makes people blush, as the slide indicates just there. So a lot of it was suppressed, and Kinsey had a very difficult career trying to fight people just for the right to explore and study something that's a part of human nature, a fundamental part of human nature. All right. Essentially, anytime the research comes into conflict or perceived conflict with the establishment or widely held ideals, there's going to be problems, right? And it doesn't mean that research shouldn't be done. I think if anything, that shows that the research should be done, so that both contexts can kind of come together and be further hashed out and stuff like that. But the current example, as I said, if you look at something like vaccinations and autism, both sides actually have both sides of this argument, pro and anti-vaxxers, have indicated some kind of negativity towards this research topic. I happen to be someone who supports vaccinations, but I also would support further exploration of this topic. If there is something in vaccinations that can trigger autism in children or adults, I think we should explore that, right? But of course, what we have to be cautious of is doing it right, reporting it correctly, providing feedback to the public that is accurate and represented well in the data. All right, so this is one of the reasons why this is such a contentious topic, the early lies about this data and obviously a lot of misinformation that spreads from that sort of stuff. So anyway, keep your data accurate, clean, don't lie, but don't be afraid to explore topics that might upset a few people.